Hello everyone! This week we're going to be chatting about sex education, aka my favourite subject. So I have been kind of studying sex education for the past year in one of my university modules. It's been a research project that we've been doing and it's something that I've always been interested in. And there are changes happening in the UK, so I thought we'd just take a moment to chat about the changes, what they are, and kind of unpick them a little bit. Just a little bit. Section 34 of the Children and Social Work Act in 2017 actually set out new guidance for sex education within the UK and how it's going to be working. And it was meant to be coming into force in September of 2020, this year, but because of COVID it's been pushed back a year. So all of the stuff we're chatting about today is going to be coming into force in September 2021. If we pause to think about why this is so important, the last time that legal framework was passed for sex education in the UK was in 2000. It was 20 years ago was the last time they updated sex education provision within the UK. 2000 was actually during the time of Section 28, which is a really infamous law which actually banned local governments from promoting homosexuality, which basically meant that within schools you could not talk about homosexuality at all, and it definitely wouldn't be mentioned in sex ed. That was kind of still the social attitude and the thinking at the time that the last guidelines were put into place, and that was what all of us who had been through school were taught with those guidelines. So it's kind of no surprise that our sex education was a bit lacking. So what are the good changes that have been put in this act? Firstly, there is the introduction of LGBT guidelines, they're mentioned in it. It's not really in depth, and I'll chat a bit more about some of the issues with the way it's put in, but it's in there, which is new. There's now mandatory health education for both primary school and secondary school children. I think if you go to private schools it's already mandatory, but it's now mandatory in state schools. They've changed the guidelines a bit, so it's actually mandatory now for primary schools to be teaching relationship education, and it's mandatory for secondary schools to be teaching relationships and sex education. So the difference is kind of relationships is a bit more about relationships, but also friendships and interactions and things like that, and sex education is more of the kind of physical knowledge to do with like sexual interactions, but also it can involve like your own body and the changes that are happening. But also that would kind of be covered in health education, I think, now. And there's a lot of added content, so there's more on consent, there's more on mental health, there's quite a lot more about like online dangers and sexting and things like that. So they fleshed out a bit more to reflect what society looks like now. So one of the really important changes that has been getting a lot of attraction is the idea of parents being able to remove their kids from relationships and sex education. So the new rule is going to be that parents will not be allowed to remove their children from relationships education. They're not allowed to do that. For sex education, parents can request to have their children removed, obviously in primary schools, because it's not actually mandatory, and in secondary schools as well. But this is the difference, up until 3 terms before that child's 16th birthday. If at that point the child wants to have sex education and chooses to have it, then the school have a duty to provide that sex education in one of those terms for that child, which actually means that it becomes the child's choice at a specific point, which is a completely new thing for the UK. What is lacking? Because we've got to critique things to be able to move forward and to challenge the system. So one of the big points is that these reforms still focus around a negative attitude towards sex and sexuality. Because they stem from this Children and Social Care Act in 2017, it's very much based the reforms off safeguarding and protecting children, which is obviously incredibly important, but it means that it's all the negative aspects of life that are picked up upon, and it really focuses on the dangers that you face. So there's loads of stuff about sexually transmitted infections and like consent and grooming and things like that. And there's loads of focus on contraception and sort of like dangers of having sex young, I guess. And also a lot of the wording of it is to do with legal guidelines. So you kind of have a duty to teach the kids the important legal points about stuff. So especially, I mean, this is coming onto a little later bit, but especially with like LGBT stuff, it was like they have a legal right to exist. And I was like, it's not a positive, it's not teaching the kids to be empowered by their own self, and It's not coming from that sex positive movement, which I think we're still a long way off in the UK from teaching in schools. And obviously sex education is still discretionary to be taught in primary schools, so that means that qualities of it are going to vary and the levels that it's taught is going to vary, so there's actually not a standard, because if you don't know that everyone's being taught it at the same age, at the same level, then you're still going to have those massive gaps in provision. And although LGBT stuff is included in the guidelines, it also says that it's up to the school when they think it is appropriate to introduce this content. So they do say in the guidelines that the content should be taught not in a single lesson, but included throughout the whole spectrum of what you're teaching, which is really positive change. But if it's up to the school, I think schools will be able to delay it and manipulate the system in order to not teach it properly if that is what they want to do. The guidance is still wishy-washy enough that actually it's not really requiring much of schools in terms of LGBT content. So then looking beyond the reforms are there, but what about the implementation? You can say whatever you want in a reform, but if you don't have a system to monitor the impact of it, if you're not training teachers and providing them with the resources they need to be able to implement these guidelines, and you're not checking up on them afterwards to make sure that it is being done in a consistent manner, this means nothing. Like, in reality, it means nothing if no one is checking up on it. So the government have actually set aside 6 million to provide resources and train teachers and stuff. But at least from my perspective, in my school I did a lot to try and change sex ed as I was getting into the older years, and I was straight up told by the head teacher to my face that it was not her problem if her teachers felt uncomfortable delivering sex ed and they were delivering bad sex ed. She said it wasn't her problem to train them, and was incredibly dismissive about the fact that it was actually their responsibility to be providing quality sex ed to us, not just the structure, which in essence looked fine. They would present you with the structure and in theory you couldn't really complain, but that was not how the lessons were being implemented, which I think shows that this guideline doesn't necessarily mean that much. And what specifically concerns me the most is the lack of resources that are available already, because I mean a lot of them aren't sex positive, which is another point, but I think that's the thing we will move towards with time. The main concern for me is the sort of LGBT content and specifically gender within a lot of these resources, because if you look at sex resources, particularly for teaching things like puberty, a lot of the stuff that will come under health education, they conflate gender and sex completely. They completely relate gender and sex into one, and if these resources aren't provided, I think that continually will be a problem, and trans kids and gender non-conforming kids will not be getting the education that they deserve. So that's what's happening. We'll wait and see how it goes. Fingers crossed it will make a big improvement. I really hope it does, but I think it's all important that if you're interested in it, you keep on supporting charities that are trying to do the good fight. So I'll see you next week. Have a lovely week.